The following is a special report from WBTV News. WBTV News reports China and the Carolinas. Reporting on Vice President Mondale's mission to China is Bruce Bowers.
From the time you step off the airplane in China, you're here with a strange sense of being in a very different kind of place. The weather is humid. The very smell of the air is different enough to make you realize you're on the opposite side of the earth from the Carolinas. China is mysterious largely by its own doing. For 30 years, the Chinese have blocked out Western influence. Only since President Nixon's arrival here in 1972 has China started opening its doors to the West. The People's Republic is a place of startling contrasts. There's the capital city of Beijing with its main boulevards carefully lined with symmetrical rows of trees. The streets and public squares are kept spotless. But at the same time, it is not uncommon to find people doing their laundry in the city's sewers. Most of the city's 7.5 million people travel by bicycle. There are no privately owned cars in China. There's a crowded bus system, but a subway is under construction. The country's historic buildings reach into antiquity. The roots of the civilization go back more than 2,000 years, but when compared with development of the West, China seems hopelessly out of date. New construction is slow because of clearly outdated building methods. One bright spot is artistic achievement in China. Beijing has a respected opera and ballet. But for the millions of peasants who are the principal beasts of burden tending the fields, the opera and ballet are a faraway dream. We saw virtually no modern farm machinery. The government has started to recognize the problem and is showing signs of flexibility. Now the peasants do not have to turn their entire crop over to the state. They are allowed to sell some of their fruits and vegetables at the free market, a small but distinct step in the direction of capitalism. There are other changes in the wind. The country's drive to modernize is allowing certain concessions to Western thought. The communists are tolerating a limited amount of dissent. Thousands of people visit Democracy Wall in Beijing daily to read the latest wall posters. While we were there, a small sit-down demonstration was taking place nearby. A Chinese university student who is studying English translated some of the posters for us. Some were critical of Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping. What do most people want to say when they put a poster up?
In their life, in their work, they met some trouble. They can't put their suggestion to the leaders, so they've come to Peking and put this old character poster.
Does it have any effect? Do the leaders read these posters?
It doesn't make any difference because we have our socialist system and discipline. If they have any suggestion and some points, they have to put them to their leaders, to their head official. But most of them, they met some trouble. The leaders have done something bad to them, so they have to come here, and they are short of money. Sometimes they have to spend their night in the street.
Yes. And that happens quite frequently, I take it.
Yes, quite frequently.
Although the Chinese themselves may not think the posters do any good in airing their dissent, United States officials are impressed with what they see as a growing tolerance for free expression. They say these small gestures would not be allowed in the Soviet Union. There is some speculation that the Chinese leaders are trying to appear more Western in order to get help from the United States and elsewhere in their long road to modernization. Modernization is one of the key things in the mind of Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders during the visit of Vice President Mondale. Mondale, among other agreements, announced the United States would help China build hydroelectric power plants, which will aid China's modernization. Mondale also used the China trip to reassure that country's leaders of a strengthening U.S. alliance and to tell the Russians they cannot push China around. South Carolina Governor Dick Riley was Mondale's invited guest on the trip, and WBTV News interviewed the two in the Vice President's hotel room.
I have never been on a diplomatic mission for our country where more substance was involved than this one. We included the broadest range of discussions, agreements, understandings of any that I've ever been on. If there was ever a trip that was substance and not merely public relations, it was this trip. We had 2 long, intensive talks with the Vice Premier, Mr. Deng, a similar discussion with the Premier, Mr. Hua, and several with other leaders of the government, and then an additional series of talks with regional leaders in Xi'an and Guangzhou.
Mondale can claim a number of firsts in Sino-American relations from this trip. It was the first time an American politician had been invited to speak to the Chinese people. His speech at Beijing University was given word-for-word coverage in the Chinese media. You really put the Soviets on notice about the United States' relationship to the Chinese. Is there any danger of aggravating the Soviets with too much of that?
We are not playing a Chinese card against the Soviet Union. This visit was in no sense an anti-Soviet visit. We regard the relationship with the People's Republic of China as having its own merit, both in terms of how we get along with each other, but also in terms of serving the cause of stability in Asia and Pacific and in the Pacific area, and cooperating where we ever can on other matters. And it's all very important. And I think it's also important that that's the basis for it, and that's what that sentence in my speech meant. We see a strong and secure and an independent China as being in our interest. Every time China has been insecure, divided, it's been a magnet to draw big power confrontations. There are many citizens in your state who have had to pay the price for instability in Asia.
If I had to really observe something that certainly I can carry back is the sight in rural Xi'an or in the city of Canton, thousands and thousands of Chinese people cheering our vice president in a warm, smiling, clapping, cheering way. And the empathy, the warmth between the two was something I'll never forget, and I think it's been a good week for the United States of America.
I hope, incidentally, I haven't talked to the governor about this, I would hope that the state of South Carolina would consider establishing a sister state relationship with one of the provinces of China. Several other states are considering it. For example, Shanghai and San Francisco established sister city relationships. I think the Chinese are interested in that. If we could have more people-to-people contact, if South Carolina businessmen and women could get involved with that province and elsewhere in business opportunities, that's the way you make the thing human.
Although the trip was productive in many areas, there remain differences on the issue of textiles. We wanted to take a closer look because of the possible impact on jobs in the Carolinas. We arranged a tour of Beijing textile mill with Governor Riley. Our Chinese host decided to show us a large textile plant that has 3,000 workers and about 300 managers and technicians. It is one of about 70 mills in the Beijing area where 80,000 people work in textiles. This plant produces 7.5 million square meters of cloth a year. 60% is manufactured for export. 400,000 meters of this cloth is being produced to be shipped directly to the U.S. It is not the only cloth from this plant that will wind up competing with textiles produced in this country. Some will be routed through Hong Kong and shipped to the States later. The Chinese want to ship a lot more cloth directly to the United States, but because of unilateral quotas imposed by the Carter administration in June, those exports are being suppressed. At this time, the failure of the U.S. and China to reach a joint agreement is a major sore spot in trade relations. Vice President Mondale talked with Chinese leaders about that during his visit, but reported no progress.
We're trying to get a textile agreement with the People's Republic of China. We have been unable to reach one yet, and therefore we've had to impose a range of quotas on particular types of textiles. We would much prefer to have an agreement that could handle the situation more adequately from our standpoint, and I believe from their standpoint. They show interest in that, and we press them to recommence the textile negotiations, and that will now be handled through diplomatic channels.
The United States has bilateral textile agreements with 18 other nations. Those are renegotiated every 4 years. The Chinese have been unwilling to agree to similar quotas because they say trade with the U.S. is just developing and should not be restrained so early.
The thing that worries American textile manufacturers the most about throwing the door open to Chinese products is not the immediate impact, but the potential of a country with a workforce of 560 million people and with increasing productivity. Just this week, the official Chinese news agency released figures showing that the total output of the country's textile industry is up 8% so far over the same period last year.
There are fundamental differences in the way the textile industry operates in China that help account for the growing productivity. Although the machinery here is outdated by our standards, workers are constantly reminded of their patriotic duty to be productive. There are posters and signs everywhere urging workers to produce for the good of the people and the revolution. Loudspeakers constantly bombard workers with communist admonitions to be productive. Governor Dick Riley of South Carolina says Chinese imports must be regulated by quotas and tariffs to protect jobs in the Piedmont.
Textiles, you see, are controlled in practically every country. We're not the only country that limits textile importation. And certainly I think it's incumbent on our government in the United States to keep us on a par with other countries, to enable our textile people to be able to be in the free competition of textile production without having the unfair situation of competing with places where there are no regulations, no OSHA regulations, very low salary government employees, and that's an unfair competitive situation. And I think it's perfectly fair, perfectly proper for our country to keep the textile industry in the realm of competition. That's our system.
One reason production costs are so low in China is because they don't have to meet any noise requirements laws like in the United States, and the workers here are only paid 54 yuan a month. That's roughly $35 per month's work.
That means there can be tremendous profit to the importers who bring Chinese textiles into the United States. Veronica Yap represents the largest group of those buyers. She says her trade is being killed by overly stringent import quotas.
Like I say, that we certainly are for quotas. You know, we have to protect the American workers, American industry first and foremost. But in terms of percentage that comes in right now, it's only 2% or less. We're really, you know, making a mountain out of a mole. You see, what our government is talking right now, or the South, you know, the unions are talking right now, they're talking about the rate of growth, where you come from 0, since we haven't had trade with China for so long, naturally to where it is now, it's quite staggering. But if you talk about actual, the fact, reality, it's only 2%. It's really so small.
But there is a potential for a great deal of harm to the employment picture in the South.
Well, I don't even know about that, because being less than 2% or 2% right now is so small. It's insignificant, whereas you take Taiwan and Hong Kong has so much larger quotas.
The unilateral quotas imposed by the U.S. are effective until next June, while negotiations continue. But what if no bilateral agreement satisfactory to the Chinese and to the American textile industry can be reached?
Our position is, unless we can get an agreement satisfactory to our nation, we will stick with the unilaterally imposed quotas that are in place.
Like any tourists who go to China, the Vice President's party wanted to see the magnificent relics of Chinese dynasties from thousands of years ago. The first stop was the Forbidden City. For hundreds of years, the city was restricted for the use of the emperor and his official entourage. The Imperial Palace and the other ornate buildings inside Tiananmen Gate are surrounded by a moat that enclosed the 250-acre complex. The Vice President's party was awed by the ornate thrones where emperors sat for at least 500 years, after construction began about 1400 A.D. The next stop was the Great Wall of China. A 3,300-mile-long wall was built to keep out the barbarians from the north. It failed to keep out Genghis Khan, and these days is attracting thundering hordes of American politicians.
Well, it's very impressive to think of what in the 15th century, and it'd be right impressive feat for the 20th century. Very impressive. One of the real sights to have the opportunity to see in this world.
Any description seems understated when you realize the construction was done here 2,500 years ago. The Great Wall is said to be the only man-made structure astronauts could recognize from the moon. Mondale and Riley also paid a visit to an archaeological site near Xi'an where 2,000-year-old terracotta statues are being unearthed. The army of 6,000 life-size men and horses was built as a decoy to protect the tomb of Emperor Chen, who unified China.
They are as close to real life as imaginable. The horses, everything's absolutely unbelievable. We saw arrows that are in perfect conditions, swords that are in perfect condition, chariots, you could see the outline of where it had been, charred wood. Since this area had been burned once, you can see the charred doors. This has got to be one of the great archaeological finds of all time.
Well, it is a very, very fascinating find, archaeological find. I suspect will rank along with Tutankhamun in Egypt and all of the other great finds.
Tourists Mondale and Riley also took a look at a commune in southern China where 65,000 people live. They dropped in on the school in the commune, observed a math class, and watched a ping pong demonstration.
This collective farm grows rice, and communist authorities point to it as an example of what communism is supposed to be like. Before the takeover in 1949, this commune was importing rice from all over the country for its people to eat. Now it exports to other parts of the nation.
Although this is not the typical Chinese commune, Mondale and Riley learned an important lesson here. Life has improved for some of the peasants. At least now the communists can brag that most of their 900 million people are being fed.
When we came to China, we wanted to see all the sights: the Great Wall, Tiananmen Square, and the Great Hall of the People. But we also wanted to see Carolinians. Sidney Rittenberg was first on our list. He was a Charleston native who was educated at Chapel Hill. 34 years ago, he left the Carolinas to live a sometimes precarious existence behind the bamboo curtain.
Rittenberg lives in the sprawling Friendship Hotel complex on the outskirts of Beijing. He and his wife, Yu Lin, paint a portrait of the ideal family with their 4 children. 3 daughters are in college, 2 are medical students. Rittenberg came to China with the United States Army during World War II and decided to stay. This summer, he packed up the family for his first visit back home since the 1940s. Although he has spent more than 3 decades here in China, Rittenberg has remained a U.S. citizen, and as a writer has had a unique view of the China that has been closed to the West. He has been on friendly terms with most Chinese leaders over the years, but he has also been viewed with suspicion. During the Cultural Revolution of the late 1960s and early 1970s, Yu Lin spent 3.5 years in a labor camp. Mr. Rittenberg spent 10 years in solitary confinement, both prisoners of the now disgraced Gang of 4, led by the widow of Mao Zedong.
Why have you chosen to remain in China for these years?
Well, if you want to go right back to North Carolina, to Chapel Hill, where we both went, it goes back to Dr. Frank Graham, really, the president of the school at that time, who gave many of us that were students there the idea that what happened in other countries, particularly in the ones that were underdeveloped countries, was very important to people in the United States. And then later on, when I got in the Army and went to Stanford and was sent to learn Chinese for the Army, I became very much interested and convinced that developing cooperation and friendship between the United States and China was one of the biggest, one of the most important things that there was for the whole world.
But you stayed on here through 10 years in solitary confinement, which is a little mind-boggling.
Well, it was a little mind-boggling, yeah, but I stayed on because...
that was your choice?
Yeah, it was my choice because otherwise the ideas that I'd worked for, and many of us had worked for so hard, just would have gone right down the drain. I would have had to give it all up and say, okay, I'm finished. as far as U.S.-China relations is concerned, just go back home and forget about the whole thing. And I was not prepared to do that. Also because I was convinced that that was an aberration of the normal development in China, that that period, the Cultural Revolution, was going to be over, and that after it was over, that there was a very good chance that there would be the kind of development that we're seeing today. When that door clanged shut behind me, one of the first things I thought of was that the people that are called the Gang of Four, Jiangqing, they were saying that all these American friends of China are just a bunch of enemy agents, or they're weak sisters that run away whenever things get tough. And I thought, well, here I am shut up in this little room. There's really nothing else that I can do, but I can do this one thing, and that is prove that that's a lie, that that's not so. Because I could prove that here's one American that's not either of those things. I think that they are, they were fascists, tyrants. They were very vicious people. They would stop at nothing to reach their ends. And they persecuted, caused the deaths of goodness knows how many people.
Do you believe in the present system of government in China?
I believe in what they commit themselves to now, yeah. I do.
That being?
Well, that being to build a system, not this year, not next year, it's not going to be completed, but gradually to build a system where people in China will have democracy, both politically, universal suffrage, elections at all levels and so on, politically and economically. In other words, where they'll have democratic management of their farms and their industrial enterprises and so on, as well as of the state apparatus. I do believe in that, and I think that most Americans that understand what they're trying to do agree with it too. My experience at home. If you look at the label, you see that's where we went off 40 years ago. You look at the label and you say, oh, they're going to join with the Russians one day and fight against us. They're all the same thing. But that was a tragic mistake because they weren't the same thing at all. You got to look at what people actually stand for and what they do, not just at what the label is.
All right, Rittenberg is in the process of writing a book about his years in China, the leaders he has known, and the years he has spent in prison. Guangzhou is the final stop for the Mondale party in China. There is the usual flurry of activity at the airport, photographers scurrying for the best position, security men keeping an anxious eye on the crowd, Chinese dignitaries lining up to give the vice president the proper welcome. And here is Mario Lou Hauser Sims, former Charlottean, with the job of seeing that the vice president's wife has a smoothly run stop in Guangzhou.
She has advanced this trip, which means that she's come ahead of our arrival, and she's gone over the entire route. She's met with the people who are responsible for the various places that, where I will go, and she's worked out all of the arrangements so that everything will be smooth sailing. You have to be very well organized, very disciplined, and know exactly what is required. She makes all of the arrangements so that when I come in, I don't have to worry about those things. She's taken care of them.
It is up to Mary Lou to see that the vice president's wife shows up on time for the opening of the first U.S. consulate in China in 30 years. And while other American officials are toasting the occasion with champagne, Sims had to worry about Mrs. Mondale's next appointment in half an hour. Limousines and staff buses must be ready to go on time. The next stop is one of the things high on Mrs. Mondale's priority list, the School of the Performing Arts for talented Chinese youngsters. Mary Lou arranged this school as a stop.
Well, I'm the lucky one. I get to go in advance and see everything, some of the things that she doesn't get to see. Because I work with her on a daily basis and I know the things that she's most interested in, I try to sort out among all the interesting possibilities the events that she would gain the most from.
During the China trip, Mrs. Mondale has concentrated on cultural stops, while the Vice President has been involved in the more serious matters of state.
It is a fun job. It's a fun job. There's a lot of detail. There's a lot of work that is, should I say, busy work. But you're busy every minute that you're here, that you're in a country. And usually on foreign trips, we spend about 10 days to 2 weeks in advance of their arrival, preparing for their visit.
Mary Lou admits her job is something of a political plum. She got her start working for Senator Sam Ervin during the Watergate days. After he retired, she moved on to work for Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia. With 6 years' experience on Capitol Hill, it was just a matter of being at the right place at the right time to land the job with Mrs. Mondale.
It is difficult to summarize a 10-day trip to China in 30 minutes, but I'd like to make a personal observation. Before making this trip, I'd always visualized China as a big power threat to the United States on a level equal with that of the Soviet Union. But as Sidney Rittenberg pointed out, I'm afraid some of us had looked at the communist labels and jumped to the conclusion that they stood for the same thing. But after seeing the leaders up close and looking into the smiling faces of hundreds of thousands of ordinary Chinese people, I believe there is a difference. Those in our party were convinced that the Chinese were reaching out, hoping to establish a firm bond of friendship with the United States. Governor Riley said he had never thought of China as a place for which he could hold much affinity, but his mind was changed by the warm reception. If our relations with China continue along their present track, a lot of other American minds are likely to be changing too. For WBTV News, I'm Bruce Bowers. Good night.